We've had some security breaches here at Quiet Mountain, so the place has been on lockdown for the last few weeks. Finally got a chance to make a new response though. This time we're looking at Steve Shives. Oh yeah, bringing out the most robust arguments now.
What happens when one of our noblest pursuits is co-opted by one of our darkest, most destructive prejudices? Nothing good. Here are 5 dangerous things about scientific racism.
For those of you not familiar with Steve, he was once a fairly respected atheist who got bit by the feminism bug, and hasn't been the same ever since. Once a champion of free speech and intellectual discourse, Steve now openly advocates for anti-platforming deplorables and blocking anyone who disagrees. I, however, am not #blocked by Steve. I'm gonna tweet this video to him when I get a chance. Anyway, enough babbling. Fuck, it's cold in here. I'm putting this in to remind myself to ask maintenance about the vents. It's piping cold air in from somewhere. Lots of rattling, too.
Number 1, it intellectualizes racism. The term scientific racism refers to attempts to use valid scientific research in fields such as genetics or anthropology to validate racist ideas, most commonly the idea that certain races are inherently superior or inferior to others.
That's part of the standard definition of racism, so sure. However, it's primarily the pseudoscientific study of techniques such as phrenology and 19th century attempts to separate the then-known human ethnogroups. It was ignorant and misguided at best. Fortunately, mainstream science has since then gotten its shit together.
The current and long-standing opinion of the overwhelming majority of scientists is that race is too ambiguous and informal of a concept to be of much use to science, and furthermore, there is no evidence whatsoever to substantiate the notion that racial differences, however we might define those, play a significant role in determining the behavior and abilities of people. In other words, scientific racism is definitely racism, but it sure ain't science.
As someone who actually studied human anthropology in college, you can distinguish between wide groups of ethnicities. It's a functional part of criminal forensics, to the point where forensics and anthropologists can accurately identify the race of a human skeleton. By race, I refer to geographic groups of humans. Over the course of modern human evolution, minor differences have emerged, mostly in allele expression. Forensics can usually tell the difference between a Caucasian, African, and Asian skeleton. These are just broad examples. Much in the same way that forensics can identify the sex of the person by their bone structure. Dimorphism is a thing, after all. Now, certain ethnic groups are susceptible to certain diseases, and most groups have adapted to their respective environment. For instance, the sickle cell trait is primarily found in West Africa, where roughly 25% of the population has it. It's also found in some other Mediterranean countries and in South America. This is important because it provides a survival advantage against malaria. Unsurprisingly, the regional overlap between sickle cell trait and malaria-hit regions is considerable. High-altitude adaptations have been found within Tibetans, Ethiopians, and Andeans, demonstrating convergent evolution among otherwise geographically separated groups. This is due to the selective pressures of their respective extreme environments. Most of us would suffer or even perish with long-term exposure to high altitudes, while members of these groups not only survive, but thrive. While there are physiological differences between geographic groups, all of these groups are still within the same species, Homo sapiens sapiens. Populations evolve over time to better suit their environment, though humans, at least in the last several hundred years, have started modifying the environment on a mass scale to suit them. It will be interesting to see how this affects human evolution in the long term, though we will all be dead by then. Now, if a large population of humans fucked off to Mars for a couple 100,000 years, we might see a divergence of species. Martians would experience different selective pressures than Terrans, and breeding would be restricted to that Martian population. With separate pressures and partner availability, Martian genetics may change to the point where Martians can no longer produce viable offspring with Terrans, effectively making them a separate species, Homo sapiens martianus or whatever. I'm probably being conservative on the timeline, but you get the idea. It's a fun thought experiment and could make for a fascinating sci-fi story.
Number 2, it confuses science with pseudoscience. Scientific racism is a relatively modern term for a collection of theories and ideologies that began popping up in the 18th century.
This seems reasonable, no argument here.
It was Carl Linnaeus, the great Swedish botanist and father of modern taxonomy, who laid the foundation for much of scientific racism by categorizing humanity into 4 distinct racial groups: American, meaning indigenous Americans; European, meaning white Europeans; African, meaning black people; and Asian, which he first described as brown and then later revised to yellow.
You're giving Linnaeus too much credit here. He categorized humanity based on existing knowledge that he and his contemporaries possessed. It was faulty and eventually abandoned, though it linked back to biblical interpretations where different races were touted. This led to early scientists trying to do what humans do best: organize and categorize. It was perhaps ignorant, however, I wouldn't go so far as to call it malicious.
Though the idea that there are significant biological differences between racial groups is no longer widely accepted in the scientific community, in scientific racist circles it remains a fundamental dogma.
This statement is inaccurate, Steve. Anthropology and medicine can distinguish between ethnic groups. I suppose it depends on how you define significant. I'm going to be charitable and guess that you mean that we can't treat racial groups like discrete races in Dungeons & Dragons, where there is a mechanical difference between orcs, humans, elves, dwarves, dragonborn, whatever weird half-breeds you find.
Other pseudoscientific concepts with close ties to scientific racism include phrenology, the idea that the size and shape of the cranium is an indicator of intelligence or moral character, and biological determinism, the notion that human behavior is entirely determined by genetic factors.
This seems accurate. No problems here.
Making racism sound superficially scientific undermines genuine science, but it does something even more harmful than that.
Any kind of pseudoscience undermines genuine science, and you have to call it out when you see it. I'll ask the obvious question. What's more harmful?
Number 3, it justifies social inequality. To purveyors of scientific racism, it makes perfect sense that black folks and other people of color are underprivileged compared to white folks because people of color suffer from certain genetic disadvantages that make it virtually impossible for them to compete with white people, and in particular, white men.
To people who believe it, sure. I don't know any racists, so I can't say for certain. Do I sense projection, though?
Under this view, programs such as public assistance for people with low incomes or affirmative action are futile efforts to alter the natural state of things. Racial inequalities and other perceived injustices in our society might feel unfair to the people experiencing them, but there's really nothing anyone can do about them. It's just the way things are. It's not racist. It just so happens that white people actually are superior. Except that's not actually true, but so what? As long as people believe it, right? And what happens when enough people believe it?
That's a dark view of things if that's true. I'm sure some people believe it, but exactly how prevalent is this?
Number 4, it empowers and legitimizes white supremacists. You know which group of people really love scientific racism? I'll give you a hint, it's not scientists.
No shit, Sherlock. It's the white supremacists. Though there are probably some scientists who also are supremacists. I don't personally know any, though.
It's the other one. For instance, alt-right founding father Jared Taylor. He loves the idea that white folks are genetically superior to black folks because if that's true, then he seems like less of an asshole for saying things like, quote, "When blacks are left entirely to their own devices, Western civilization, any kind of civilization, disappears."
I thought Milo Yiannopoulos and Richard Spencer founded the alt-right. You like putting words into his mouth, that's for sure. I won't defend him, but at least show some more evidence than a single journal entry. He claims he's a race realist, not a racist or supremacist. Now, according to the definitions y'all like to run with, because he says he's one thing, he can't be another. Isn't that how it works? I'm not a misandrist, I'm a feminist. Though to be fair, he's probably an asshole. Who knows?
Who else? Oh, how about David Duke, arguably the most famous white supremacist in the United States? Duke once said, quote, "Are facts racist too? It's considered noble to concern yourself with the well-being of minorities, even at the farthest ends of the earth. But if you're white and you concern yourself with the well-being of your own people, even of your own children, you're deemed racist. The real racism today is not by white people. It's against white people.
He's wrong. Racism still exists and will always exist against all peoples. I don't recall, do you believe that it's impossible to be racist against white people? I know several of your compatriots hold this reverse racism doesn't exist belief.
He's been preaching scientific racism since the 1970s. But some of you might be wondering why I chose to make this video now. Is this another instance of me getting a wild hair up my ass about a particular subject, like that video about the John Wilkes Booth conspiracy theory a few weeks back? No. Actually, I wanted to discuss scientific racism for a very specific reason.
Well, he did found the Louisiana chapter of the KKK, though he later left the group due to increasing associations with violence. He is also a supporter of Holocaust denier Ernst Zundel, who is currently in German prison. I don't think Holocaust denial should be a crime, but whatever, it's Germany. I see a lot of anti-Semitism in Duke's views, though I can't find anything about scientific racism. God, did I just offend David Duke?
Number 5, it's making a comeback. A couple of months ago, a fairly high-profile author and podcaster had a well-known scientific racist as a guest on his podcast. Now, I don't want to tell you who this podcaster was. I'll just give you a hint and say that his name rhymes with Ham Saris, and it was Sam Harris.
Then why did you go through the preamble about not wanting to say who the podcaster was? You don't have to be so coy about it, Steve. Let's dive into your next bit, because it's really where the meat of this video lies. The rotten, decomposing meat.
His guest on a show titled Forbidden Knowledge was Charles Murray, co-author of The Bell Curve, a book that purported to show that there was a link between race and intelligence. Murray's book was thoroughly discredited and roundly rejected by the scientific community following its initial publication over 20 years ago for its questionable research and wholly unsupported conclusions. But Harris treated him like some kind of intellectual king in exile, blaming Murray's outcast status on political correctness run amok.
You have a strange way of cherry-picking evidence and making shit up. Detractors slandered Murray and his co-writer after The Bell Curve was published. Now, have you actually read The Bell Curve, or did you just read the 10-cent summary on some random site? Full disclosure, I haven't read The Bell Curve either. However, I get the feeling you didn't listen to the podcast, because I did. I got the complete opposite message from it. Sam Harris stated that he didn't know much about Murray until the podcast. He heard and read the various statements and claims made about Murray and let that flavor his views and opinions. Sam later realized that he was doing the exact same thing as Murray's detractors and supposedly anti-racist individuals. So he read the book and reached out to Murray to speak with him directly. Now, I can't go through and give you the full rundown of the podcast.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
But I'll link it. Give it a listen. It's quite intriguing. It's certainly not the white supremacist apologetics that Steve purports. This is about two academics coming together and having a discussion about the work and the real-life consequences of that work. Towards the end, he mentions the Middlebury incident and gets into some of the details. As for the Bell Curve, Murray states in the podcast that people have attempted to refute it, and instead confirmed his findings. He's not a fucking idiot. He knew he was kicking a hornet's nest, and wanted to make sure that his methods were rigorous. The overall finding, from what I understand from the podcast and Murray's own statements, is that there is some differential between averages for each racial group in America. Likewise, the differential within groups is far greater than the differential between groups. He also makes a point to state that intelligence should not be used to judge a person's character.
Like any good work of scientific racism, the Bell Curve provided racists with an intellectual-sounding justification for their racism. Sure, it doesn't even remotely reflect the opinions of experts in the relevant field, but who needs scientific consensus when you've got enablers like Sam Harris who are all too willing to lend an old white supremacist like Charles Murray a bit of their credibility to help spread that message to a whole new audience? A message which, I remind you, boils down to white people are genetically superior to non-white people. Sound familiar?
I'd love to see some evidence that racists use the bell curve for their propaganda. I'm sure some do, I just want to see you actually do the research. If you got white supremacists out of the Murray podcast, or anything else that Murray's done, then you, Steve, are out to lunch. I may or may not agree with all of Murray's views, or those of Harris, however, he comes off as a well-thought-out intellectual and measured scholar. Not some Sith Lord of the KKK that you portray him as. At no point did he even come close to saying, white people are genetically superior to non-white people, especially the men. I recommend that you listen to the podcast. It's fascinating and shows how far-reaching lies and misrepresentation spread. I think Harris even brings this up in the podcast. Murray also presents a coming problem, the emergence of the cognitive elite that is segregated from the rest of society. He also discusses the decline of general intelligence. In essence, and I hate to use the word basically,
I don't want to hear basically.
Stupid people tend to breed more often and have shorter generations. In advance, this is hyperbole for the sake of demonstration, so put away the fucking pitchforks. Whereas normal people tend to have fewer children and have them later in life, there is also a longer gap between generations, say 30 to 35 years. That's if they have biological children at all. Stupid people, however, tend to have half a dozen kids or more, with generations closer to 16 to 21 years. Furthermore, the government tends to subsidize these breeders by providing more benefits for each additional child if they're on welfare. Overall, Steve spends the majority of this video building up a straw man, then revealing it to be Charles Murray, and to a lesser extent, Sam Harris. I know Steve has problems with Sam because of his views on Islam, so he's probably lumping Sam in with the white supremacists that Steve is railing against. He likens Murray to David Duke and Jared Taylor, both objectively white supremacists. Scientific racism does exist and is pushed onto the credulous masses. It needs to be debunked when it surfaces to dissuade otherwise good-meaning people from latching onto such a hateful rhetoric. Yes, sometimes good-meaning people can believe awful things. Isn't that right, Steve? What was that sound? It must be nothing. Just the ducks again. Oh, by the way, I have something special coming up, so it should be ready very...